McGill University is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. We recognize and respect the Kanien'kehá:ka as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet today. My name's Ron Critchley. I'm president of the James McGill Society, and I just want to say that in this post-COVID era, to have a room as full of this gives me a great deal of delight and joy. For a little while during the COVID period, we were doing things just on Zoom, which caused a great deal of dancing and gnashing of teeth behind the scenes. But we managed to have sellout crowds when we did Zooms only, and it's good to see people here in person again, drinking wine, having a sandwich, and chatting. I mean, this is musical. This is an opera that knows no end. I also want to say a special thanks to Professor Austin, who brought his class today. It's not often we get students in here in such numbers, and boy, that's a joy too. This is really great, and yeah. And if this encourages you to take an interest in the history of McGill University and use the archives and the rare book library, rare book collections, I should say, that would be absolutely wonderful too. That's what we hope to get from students who show some interest in us. I also want to say a word of thanks to two guys in here, John Childs and Jonathan Roy, who do the technical stuff. They put up with us during Zoom. They've put up with us for months and months and months as we do hybrid stuff. They are an example of patience and sobriety, bar none. So thanks, guys. And that's not to forget Adria at the back with her laptop, who's monitoring even some members of the Stakes family who might want to have some words to say to us later in the presentation. And our membership secretary extraordinaire, Susan Button, she's like magic tape. She's like, Lepage's wood glue. It never gets off your hands, but you're always there, and we know that you're sticking to it. And it's great. It's great. I'm going to just say that by coming out and by supporting the James McGill Society, you actually are doing us a great service. We depend on the income from members, and it's still cheap, a la Mad Magazine. $25 a year. We've had talks about how we're going to approach the costs of the future, doing hybrid presentations, et cetera, but if you can see your way to giving us 25 plus an extra $1 or $2, we'd appreciate that. It always helps. If you have thoughts about hybrid meetings, if you prefer Zoom, if you have any questions or points to make, please let us know, because the feedback's important to us. And depending on the provincial and federal regulations and regulations regarding restaurants and group activities, etc., I think for the time being, in the next few months, we're still going to stick to the hybrid model so we can reach as many members as possible. Susan, as membership secretary, do you have anything to say? I'll just say one thing, that Peter's not with us tonight. Peter McNally, our executive secretary, or you're our membership secretary, excuse me. Keep getting confused. But Peter has been in England for the past couple of nights, and Susan will talk about that. He assured me that the financial report for the JMS will be available at our next meeting.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to take this opportunity to, because being here in person, it's wonderful to see people. I haven't been in a real in-person meeting since February 2020. So I'm overjoyed to see all of you here, and also those at home. Thank you very much. What more can I say about the membership and your devotion, but we're looking at our 200th meeting. And so that's what the best example I can say. Thank you very much. 200 meetings over 40 years. Thank you so much for your unwavering commitment to the society. I deeply appreciate it. And when Ron was talking about Dr. Frost, Stanley Frost started this. He thought it might last a couple of years while he was writing the first volume or two of the history of McGill. And he would never imagine that it would be going so strong and with still wonderful talks by interesting speakers, or as Peter would say, interesting talks by wonderful speakers. Our friend Peter is in London with Pauline Frost. Some of you might know Dr. Stanley Frost's daughter-in-law, and her 2 children are there. And Peter's going to have the great pleasure of seeing Stanley Frost's 2 great-grandsons while he's there. Unfortunately, he said he walked 5 miles and couldn't get into line for the lying in state. But you know he's committed. He went and he laid flowers at Buckingham Palace. So that's the social gossip for the moment. Thank you again to all the members. I'm deeply grateful for all this support you've shown.
And now we move on to the matter at hand, the presentation done by Chris Lyons. Well, Chris is a past president of the JMS and needs no further introduction from me. Needless to say, Gordy, who will do the formal aspect of this part, was overheard by myself saying something about revenge. He worked with Chris for many years, and was it said in French, revanche, or was it revenge? I don't know. It sounded sinister, Gordy. So I'd like to call upon Gordy Burr, another past president, and a sessional lecturer in the School of Information Studies, to introduce Chris, who, like I said, needs no introduction. Thanks, Gordy.
Okay. Hi, my name is Gordon Burr. I'm adjunct professor at McGill's School of Information Studies, teaching archives-related courses. I have the pleasure tonight to introduce the speaker, Chris Lyons, a familiar figure to many of you. I've known Chris for many years as a student in my archives course in the school, as a researcher in the McGill archives, as a rare books librarian, Osler, dedicated to making paper finding aids available over the web. Wow, back in the day, Chris. And as the head librarian at Osler, and later the head of rare books in McLennan, and most recently as the acting dean for Roar. And in all of these roles, Chris has always shown a keen interest in engaging user and donor communities with rare books, special collections, and archives. The engagement process and the identification of communities to engage has changed at McGill, and the connection of marginalized communities with the holdings of heritage repositories has now become a priority. Last year, I spoke about the unsung historical employee heroes bicentennial exhibit that I created in conjunction with students from the School of Information Studies. But the inspiration for the selection of these employees from our past was the result of a meeting with Gerard Cadet, the director of Bicentennial, when he asked me to emphasize the selection of marginalized communities as an important criteria in my selection process. This led me to the selection of Black community archivist and McGill employee Roy States as one of the subjects for the exhibit. In the throes of the pandemic shutdown, I contacted Rare Books desperately in need of images for Roy States, and found the only person physically in the McLennan building who kindly offered to scan materials and send them to me. Of course, it was Chris, just checking on things, making sure everything was in order. No surprise, given the level of his dedication to helping researchers. He also placed me in contact, kindly, with Ashley States, who was doing genealogical research on I think her grandfather, and who kindly sent me some scans of family images for the exhibit. I've been borrowing the Colgate room for a hands-on teaching laboratory for the past few years to engage my students with the McGill University records of a marginalized group, the Japanese community of Montreal. The students adopt a box from the collection and create lesson plans on how to engage the public with archival holdings. Special thanks to Chris, Jennifer, Adria, Melissa for the enthusiastic support for this project. Thank you. Chris is a wonderful teacher, researcher, and speaker with a fine, ironic sense of humor. And I'm sure that you're in for a treat tonight as he brings to you his interpretation of Roy States and his importance to the university and beyond. Thank you, Chris.
My goodness, who was that? Geez, I have like a stack of nasty things I was going to say in retort to your setting me up before, and now I can't use any of them. So I'm a bit flummoxed at the moment because I was just going to make mean comments about Gordy, who's been a wonderful colleague for so long, and a mentor as well, because as he mentioned, he was actually my first archives teacher a few years ago. And I learned a great deal from him. And the one thing I learned from Gordy, which was not on the curriculum, is how generous he always was with his time and bringing and inviting people into the archives to come and see things and work with things. And that was really a special experience for us, in a real sense of like, this is what happens when you go beyond, and this is what happens when you inspire people. And I think I'm going to work in a little bit of that as well. But I did want to just welcome all of you. It is really exciting. It's exciting to see you as in land acknowledgement, as Ron very kindly did, and I would like to say as well. You know, we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Kanehigaga, and the Anishinaabe peoples as well. And so this is wonderful. And I think this whole idea of inclusion is one, and being a special opportunity to gather together is one I'd like to expand on a bit. And I also want to say, well, before I do that, is I want to welcome my colleague and friend, Professor David Austin, who I had the great joy of working with, and who is the author of a book I've enjoyed called Fear of a Black Nation, about race, sex, and security in 60s Montreal, and his students as well. It's so great to have you guys here, and please, please, please don't make it the last time you look at any of our ugly mugs, because this is great to have you as well. I also want to say a very special thank you. I look back there, but I see it's now my slide, but to members of the States family, and this is humbling because I've worked with Roy States' collection, but I've had the chance to meet the family, and putting the two together is just a wonderful thing. So I do want to say a special welcome to Miss Crystal States, who's the niece of Roy States, Miss Margaret States, and also a niece, and Miss Faith States, a great niece. And I'm really touched, honored, and humbled that you're here with us today, and so happy you can join us. I also want to express my gratitude to Professor Terry Givens, who is someone I met recently who has a very important position within the McGill hierarchy, especially as we grapple with issues in relation to anti-Black racism. She's the provost lead and advisor on the action plan for that. She's also a political scientist, full professor as well in the Department of Political Science. And she's also the author of Look What Came In, 2 of her books. So thank you for this. One of them is more autobiographical, so her journey into her understanding of race, radical empathy, and the roots of racism, which is a multi-century overview of that. David, I would have brought my copy had I known you were here, but because I didn't, so I went to see if I could get it out of the library, but it's already taken out. So you're just too popular. So I couldn't even take the book out. Anyway, so I want to start by introducing you to the Roy States collection the way I was introduced to it as a student. like our other students here. Okay, so in the 90s, there used to be something called the 1G program. That's if you had an undergraduate degree but wanted to go into teaching, you could do a 1-year postgraduate diploma to become a teacher. And that was good because the idea of doing a 4-year B.Ed after coming off a BA in history would have been a bit daunting. So I was happy about that. And I was very lucky to get involved in a project, in part done by the Ministry of Education, part done by the Quebec Board of Black Educators, which was to find primary source material in Black Quebec history, which could be used as a complement to the curriculum, the standard curriculum, which if any of you went through the Quebec school system in the history program, has really no mention of people. The natives are like a couple of pages of, Jacques Cartier and Champlain show up and then the natives disappear. And that's it. So the idea was, let's get material into students' hands that will broaden that perspective a bit. So we went to a number of repositories to look for primary material, including rare books and special collections. And so I had my first foray into the Roy States Special Collection, and who knew that 30 years later I'd get to curate it in part. So it's fun. Follow your dreams. You never know where they end up. And that was a nice turn in my life. So I'm looking at Mr. States as a collector, and I'm looking at his collection as a way of understanding his purpose. What was he trying to accomplish? Where was he coming from? Because it's not inert. It's not like the books just showed up. There was a purpose behind it, and I wanted to untangle some of that because I think it's fascinating, and it's worth celebrating the work that people like Mr. States have done. And I'm going to use this quote as a way of illuminating this. So Sir William Osler was one of the most famous physicians in sort of Anglo-American medical history. He's still a huge superstar to many people, not only in terms of his medical work, but his way of inspiring people. We have something called the Osler Library of the History of Medicine here, which is a wonderful collection, one of the best in the world, actually, of medical material going back thousands of years, literally. Great stuff here at McGill, up the hill, good exercise, go visit. But the purpose of it was Sir William Osler's ideas. He collected the books to inspire and teach medical students. So this is a quote from him. A library represents the mind of its collector, his fancies and foibles, his strengths and weaknesses, his prejudices and preferences. Particularly is this the case if, to the character of a collector, he adds or tries to add the quality of a student who wishes to know the books and the lives of the men who wrote them. The friendships of his life, the phases of his growth, the vagaries of his mind are all represented. So this idea that you can see within someone's collection what they were trying to accomplish, what their preferences were, everything, I think holds equally true to understanding Mr. States and his collection. So who was he? And this is information I've gathered from some opportunity to talk with people, but also for some of the biographical information that's in the collection or things that I've found, like interviews he's given to people like that. So Mr. States comes from a small area in Nova Scotia called New Glasgow. You can see it up there, an industrial town. It's a mining area in Nova Scotia. He was born on February 15th, 1919. He dies in Montreal in November 1980. So that's significant. 1919, 1980, if you think of Canadian history, if you think of Black consciousness at the period and things like that, you think like this is like, you know, going to the moon in terms of just what's going on in that period. So his family is an old maritime family, came up during the American Revolution to St. John, New Brunswick. So deep roots in the Maritimes. He left school at 14 to help support his family after his father was blinded in an accident. And in an interview published in the Montreal Star, was a newspaper like the Montreal Gazette, only better, no one's disagreeing with me, right? Any of you who know the Montreal Star say it's better. I delivered the Star. It was a wonderful newspaper. And also, too, it was an afternoon paper. I'm not a morning person. I hate getting up in the morning, so I would never deliver the Gazette at 6 a.m. So Montreal Star was a better paper just for that alone. Anyway, an aside. So Montreal Star, big paper, had an interview with them, big daily, in 1973. So in it, Mr. States describes how he became a collector, like what brought him to a point where he had this wonderful collection. And he talked about how growing up in New Glasgow, in the public library, he had access to all these books and he would collect them. So that gives you a sense of how that went. So this is just around the time he died. So in 1935, when he was 16, he said that he read an article by Marcus Garvey. So Marcus Garvey, if you're familiar with him, is one of the most important people in black consciousness in the 20th century, early 20th century, Jamaican-American leader, who promoted black nationalism and pride, in part by knowing black history. So Mr. States described how this is direct quotation, he suddenly realized he didn't know anything about myself, my people, my own race. I began to look for information. I couldn't find any. The New Glasgow Library had 86,000 books. Only 2 were about Negroes. I began to look around to ask questions. I wanted to know. It became my hobby. Hobby, that's the term he uses. I might use terms like obsession, like life's mission, I think might even be more accurate. So he goes on to talk about how Marcus Garvey himself was a major influence on his outlook in life. And he quoted a quote of Marcus Garvey's, which he found particularly inspiring, which is, "Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will." So in 1939, when the Second World War broke out, Mr. States volunteered for the Canadian Army. But despite being athletic and healthy, he always was a strong man, he was rejected. He was told, it was a white man's army, direct quotation, it was a white man's army, and this was a white man's war. Finally, however, through persistence, the following year, he was able to join the Pictou Highlanders, so a local Highland regiment. So he's in the military from 1940 to 1947, and he reaches the rank of sergeant, serving overseas. Now, any of you who've been in the reserves or the military or anything like that, sergeants are ferocious beings, not human, I don't think. So I'm just imagining what an intimidating man he must have been. But despite that, 1947 returns to New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, and he states, looking back on that period, a curious thing happened. Before leaving, I was refused entrance into a theater there. When I came back in 1947 in uniform with all my ribbons, I was refused again. Now, you can't really see it, but is anyone familiar with the Roseland Theatre in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia? Is anyone familiar with this? Yes. Does anyone have a $10 bill they'd be willing to give me? I thought if I did it like subtly, it'd be like at least 1 or 2. Come up and testify. No, okay. Oh well, I tried it. Viola Desmond, 1914, 1965, was a businesswoman in Halifax, Nova Scotia, who was not only the owner of a beauty salon, she also had her own line of beauty products and her own beauty school. And unusual for the time, she not only owned her own car, and she drove it, and then she was going out on a trip to distribute some of her material to her clients, and she had car trouble in New Glasgow. She went to the local garage. The local garage said, "We're going to have to get a part from Halifax, so it's going to take a day." So she's got some well-earned and rare time on her hands. She decides to go see a film at the Roseland Theatre, has poor eyesight, so sits downstairs, is told that blacks are not allowed to sit on the main floor. They have to sit in the balcony. She says, I've got bad eyes. I need to sit close. The usher who told her she had to move gets a manager. The manager tells her she has to move. At this point, she's had it, and she realizes what was going on, and decide to stay. Manager gets police. Police and manager literally drag her out, up the stairs, out the door, into a police car where she spends the night in jail, and is charged the next day with fraud because the difference in the seating, prices of the seats were 30 and 40 cents. And that meant that the provincial tax went from 2 cents to 3 cents. And so by sitting in the more expensive seats, but not paying the extra cent, even though she offered to pay, not paying the extra cent meant that she was defrauding the government of tax revenue. So is fined $20 plus $6 court costs. That goes to the Nova Scotia Supreme Court, and the conviction's upheld. So segregation becomes legally sanctioned at this point through this case. But that's what one was facing. There are two elements to that. One is this is what people of color were facing in Nova Scotia. The other is you can see there is now the beginnings of a bit of resistance to that experience. In Roy's case, he becomes active in the community, not only in athletics, he's a very athletic person and is very community oriented, but he also begins to fight for civil rights. And he mentions in one of his interviews that there was a neighborhood in New Glasgow which was predominantly African-Canadian, and they had a problem because they had no city water. So that neighborhood was still using wells and probably using open sewers or cesspools as opposed to being hooked up to the city water supply. And there was a long fight which he led to get that rectified, and he did eventually. 1952, he moves to Montreal, becomes a CNR porter. Not an uncommon move for many Canadians, particularly of what becomes the middle class or the leading class of the community at the time, to work on the railways in Montreal, mostly centered in Little Burgundy because of its proximity to the railways and the stations. So he does that for a while and then rejoins the army, which is, again, for people looking for stability, good salary. He does, and he remains there until he's 50 years old. So he's part of the military for another 15 years. And this is what he finds and what he reflects back on. So it was a time for him to travel, to learn and see things. So he is exposed to a lot of different communities and ideas through the military and his traveling, particularly in the Middle East and other areas and in the US. And he's picking all of this up. Well, he's doing this. So he's based in Long Point, which is a large military base in Montreal, and then he moves off and he's living in town, but he gets involved in the Montreal community. I had to share this with you. Whoops, not that. There we go. So one of the community endeavors he gets involved with is the Negro Community Center, which is a group that was established in the 1920s on the basis of helping people through things like adult education, after school programs. It was a way for the community to organize, benefit, and also socialize, music and a lot of other things. I wanted to include this because this building began life as the West End Methodist Church, and my great-grandfather was baptized there in 1879, so I just wanted to include that. But the building itself, sadly, is now gone, but the archives went to Concordia University, and Concordia University has a great collection of local Montreal African-Canadian and other archives as well. A lot of it related to music, but not exclusively so. It's a major, thanks in part to Professor Austin's work, some major collections are available there. He was also involved in the Union United Church, which still exists, in the United Negro Improvement Association, which is Marcus Garvey's organization, and the Legion. He also is continuing, he's also very interested. So here's a man, he had to leave school at 14, but he's learning and seeing and curious. He actually takes night courses to finish high school. He takes some university courses. And this kills me. Okay, this really, I got to say, this makes me jealous. Not only does he meet Martin Luther King, but he gets to talk to Malcolm X for 4 hours at a mosque in Boston. So if you could just imagine, I mean, just even listening to him for 4 hours would, that'd be, you could kill me after, it'd be so good. But they actually sit there and talk to him for that long. And I mean, so this is a guy up from a very humble beginnings, and here he is. He's really plugged in and engaged. And so this is what's important. He retires from the Army in 1969. He's having eye trouble, actually. As a reader, this must have been really grim, but he does get better. And from 1973 to 1980, he's supervisor of special events and activities in the physical plant at McGill University. So he's very much responsible for major activities at McGill, such things as organizing convocation or installations of principles and that sort of thing. So major responsibilities. I think someone with this background in the military, that's right up his alley, right? There's organizing, it's, you know, making sure things are there, and you can just see how good he'd be at it. But so we got that, but at the same time you have this interest in history and self-identity. And so, in a sense, it's a way of developing oneself, right? Through reading and talking and traveling. But there's also, for Mr. States, a really strong advocacy role and an outreach role. So he's not just cultivating his own garden, so to speak. He's also very much engaged in the community itself. So it takes two parts. It's that gathering of knowledge, but then it's the communication of that knowledge. And that's where we see the other side of some of his work. So he would write historical columns. He would give presentations and talks. So here's one. I don't have a date for this, but that's an example of some of the work he did. That comes out of a scrapbook of his work. He also did things like here, the St. James United Church, the largest church, I think, United Church in Montreal. It's on St. Catherine Street, just near Blurry. Used to be covered by buildings in front of it because they rented it out, the space in front of the church for extra money. They took them away recently. So here he is giving a talk at 11 a.m. on the clash of color, Black Power and its meaning. So think of it. So this is probably, I don't think I have a date for this, but if you think of it, Black Power and its meaning. So this is probably late 60s and early 70s. So the movement has gone in a couple of directions, and you know, there would be people who would be interested. So here he's an interlocutor now between what's going on in the community and speaking and explaining it to people outside. So he gave lots of different lectures, and he also set this up, and I think this is fun, and this is where I came in, right? So with his military background and his interest in military history and his interest in Black history, he got the first of its kind in Canada. He has made an exhibition of the material he collected to talk about the involvement of African-Canadians in Canadian military history. And he's right, I don't know of anyone else. There is now more recognition of, like in the First World War, the No. 2 Canadian Construction Battalion. There's awareness now of that, but he was really breaking ground and including different conflicts in that. So here you have an example, and this is actually one I used for some missing pages, of someone who really had to fight to become a member of the Royal Canadian Air Force during the Second World War, and then was able to do so and then had a very long career there. And that's the plaques, right? So we have a box of these, and they were the different ones that he would go to different places, set them up, and then you'd have the exhibition, and then I'm assuming he would animate them. Okay, and I love this one. So this is a picture, so this is going back to his roots or his home. So here's the War Memorial in New Glasgow, right? Beloved New Glasgow. So I don't know if you can read the caption, but I'll read it for you. So he writes, "This memorial was unveiled in the early 1930s. Black, Indian, and veterans of other nationalities were shocked at the unveiling when a Scottish piper loomed over them. It appears that only Scots from Pictou County won the war. Suggestions were made to topple the piper, denoting a lack of recognition of other veterans." So you can see where the sense of representation and literally being wiped out from history would be so galling for people who actually did put their life on the line to serve their country. So he also became a spokesperson, again, like I said, the communication role, the interlocutor role he was playing in the Montreal community and the Canadian communities here. So here he is being interviewed in the Montreal Star about situation in schools. So that's who he is. Oh, and I should end it with this, and this is quite sweet because it's right at the end of his life. The National Black Coalition of Canada recognized him with an achievement award, Lifetime Achievement Award, which is really quite wonderful. And I'm glad they were able to do it when he did. I don't know if his health suggested to them that it was important that they do this, but they did. And they did just at the right time. So that's who he is as a person. And I think it's important, as going back to the Osler quote, it's important to understand who he was to see what he's created. And what, from there, what do we now quite proudly curate and continue to make accessible for people, because that's what Roy wanted. So there are two major parts to it. There's the published material, like in terms of books and related, which are cataloged. So we'll take that, we'll look at that, because that's what's listed there. And if you look at it, there are about 688 books and other cataloged items, like reports and that sort of thing. Most of them, sorry, this is me being the librarian geeking out here, eh? Okay, so you can see the major areas are in history of the Americas, including US history. There's also things like general European, local history, social sciences, language and literature, so people like James Baldwin or other writers, Ronald Wright. And so that's what you get. So you can see very much a representation of what he's interested in, right? Historical and contemporary Black history and Black issues. And when the material is published, this I really found quite interesting, because if you look, he's not an antiquarian collector. So he's not trying to get 18th century, 19th century material. What he is doing is collecting probably material that's accessible but interesting, and it probably also represents the fact that there's probably a lot more publishing going on now in the, say, like the 50s, 60s, and the 70s that deal with issues like African history and contemporary issues of race relations, because that's become very much an issue front and center in society. So his collection represents what's accessible to him at the time. It also, for place of publication, some Canadian but not exclusively Canadian collection, and almost exclusively an English collection. And I think that's important because I don't know about his linguistic skills, but chances are people growing up in Nova Scotia in the first half of the 20th century are probably not bilingual if they weren't Acadian. So what this says to me is he was buying stuff he could read. This wasn't just a collection like I collect a lot of things. I don't know. Think of things you collect. I'm embarrassed to say what I've got 40 typewriters. That's what I collect. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have admitted that. But I did, or things like that. So he is collecting these books because they're useful, not because they're fun, not because they're pretty, but because he wants the knowledge. And it's an interesting collection because in its totality, it's interesting because you'll see that a lot of the material, particularly in the Quebec context, is unique. So we're lucky to get this material because he was so aggressive in his collecting. And just to give you an example of it, this is good. These are just random, what is it called, like biblioporn or something like that. It's taking pictures of bookcases. So if you look at this, you could see this is contemporary material. So Idi Amin, Uganda, 70s. You have Kwame Nkrumah, the father of Ghana. So you have an interesting Tanzania. So you can see he's really collecting the African history material and contemporary politics. I like this because this is the Marcus Garvey, so you can see, again, the influence on his thinking, but then also Alex Haley and Roots. When I was in grade 4, so I guess I was 8 years old, there was a TV miniseries based on that called Roots. And it was the most watched, I think, television episode, or at least serial of its time. It was huge. And I think for many of us, I was 8, but it's so easy for me to say, it was an eye-opener to African American history, because previous to that, Martin Luther King perhaps, but this was really an opportunity for people to appreciate, I think, the history and the experience of African Americans over time. So the interesting thing is you have on the one side the published material, which is interesting. It's great to have. It really tells us who Mr. States was. But here's the real gold, in my mind, of our collection. And that is, it's not the uncatalogued material. And for the most part, it's what we call gray literature. It's the kind of stuff that's not easy to find. It was not often collected, particularly at the time in the 60s and 70s when he's collecting it. And it dovetails beautifully in the rise of Black consciousness, independence movements, heavy immigration once Canada removes race qualifications for immigration. So this is like a beautiful meeting up of situations to make this such a great collection. So here's an example. So People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola publication called Angola in Arms from 1972. If you're familiar with African history, long after the British and French, for the most part, and even the Belgians, had decolonized, at least in political terms, out of Africa, the Portuguese were in addition to, say, the South Africans and the Rhodesians were the only sort of major colonial power there. So becomes a cause célèbre in terms of that. But look at this. It's distributed by the Information Center in Richmond, BC. And to me, that raises all kinds of questions. What's the connection there? What's the interest there? What's that say about consciousness of people in the Vancouver area at the time? So this is a thread of thought I think I've never seen any evidence of and interest in. So for me, that was a real, okay, there's something going on here. And if I could find more evidence, I would love to trace this in terms of consciousness and identification. A number of community newspapers, a lot of titles no one has, or bits and pieces here and there, but really, really, really elusive stuff. And for the most part, there are some issues, but it's not like you get a full run of them, depending on how long the run is and if anyone knows they are. But that's an example of one. The Toronto local newspaper called Contrast, which may have existed for a while and may have been better known. Grasp, which is out of Halifax, and if you look at the mailing label, he was receiving that in the mail. So another interesting area, and it shows the extent to which he was willing to collect material. And then, okay, it gets even more obscure. Radical Press, the Black Liberation Action Committee. I can't find anything on who these guys are. Mimeographed here, the Black Action Party. I think you quote them. Anyway, and so again, that's another group, again, very, very obscure, great information, anyone looking for information on that era and trying to understand the politics of the era. And then again, another example of that. And then, okay, so this is fun. So you got the newspapers, then you get other things. This is what we call ephemeral material as well. And this is something put together by the Quebec Black Board of Educators, what you should know about your children in their school. And essentially what this is a lot of parents at this point have emigrated from the Caribbean. And this is in English, so these would be Jamaican, Trinidadian, St. Vincent, people like that. Very, very, very particular system. Coming up here to this wacko system, which is confessionally based and completely different than anything. So it's a way of explaining to them, this is what it's like. This is how the schools work here. This is what you can expect from the schools here. And it's amazing because it tells you the adaptation skills of people are really amazing, like things you wouldn't necessarily think of as here's an issue. You're used to the schools doing this with your students, and your responsibility is this. This is where you're coming from. You come here and it's a completely different thing, and often there's a lot of confusion and resentment because what you are thinking the schools are doing are not what the schools are thinking they're doing. And the way around this to negotiate these is to develop things like this. Never heard about it. I actually, one of the partners, as I mentioned before, was a Quebec Board of Black Educators, although in this case I think they've turned around, or I've forgotten. But anyway, that was like, I didn't know they were doing things like this. So again, I find this fascinating material. And there's also a lot of non-Canadian material as well. As you can see here, like Black Panther newsletter. And I'm just going to go ahead because I don't think there's a quote I don't want to miss. No, there isn't. No good quotes, just me. And I have that, again, very obscure. I've looked up some of these titles, like in WorldCat, so to get a university, and sometimes there's no record, sometimes there might be one place somewhere that holds them. I had to throw that in because of New Orleans. My daughter lives in New Orleans, so that's me being a proud dad in that way. But it really does bring, the collection itself, as you can see, is a very strong combination of material. And I think what we have is something that we do need to catalog better so more people know about it, but I think it's really important that just through venues like this, we can talk about this and get the word out so that this material can be used. And what I like most of all, and is paying tribute to Mr. Roy States, because he was the man who put this all together and collected at a time he did to collect this material, which wasn't being collected. And his widow very kindly donated it to McGill, so it's here and it's available. And 40 years later, and 50 years later, and 100 years later, we can do something with it. And I think, if anything, that's the greatest gift of all. So thank you. Oh, but for the Zoom, I think they need to speak in the mic. Speak in the mic. Yeah.
Just go and speak in the mic. I want to just thank you, Chris, for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
There's one point I'd like to make and a couple of questions.
Do you want to?
Should
he use the mic?
Should I use the mic?
Or, yeah, just go behind.
Or yeah, I'll sit down. You go ahead.
Yeah, okay. My first point is, you showed the pamphlet on Angola, and it seemed to me that he might have been a Saturday morning visitor to the Ho Chi Minh bookstore over on St. Louis Square, because that's exactly the type of stuff they had en masse about that time.
What was the name of it?
The Ho Chi Minh bookstore.
Okay, I thought you were joking.
No, I'm serious. I'm serious. So, if there's anything that's stamped Ho Chi Minh bookstore or whatever, where he must have got a lot of stuff. The second thing, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. Was he a Freemason? Is there any evidence that he was a Freemason?
He was in the Legion.
He was in the Legion.
If that's parallel.
No, it's not parallel, but it could be. But in some cases, but if he joined the Legion, he would be taking an oath that says he's not a communist. Mm-hmm. So he's approaching this from a very Canadian, almost neutral point of view, it seems to me, in terms of left and right. The other thing I wanted to ask was about his time at McGill. Did you ever speak to people about what he was like afterwards, after he retired, after he died? Did you get any sense from letters or notes from people about the contribution he made? Because as Master of Ceremonies, it seems to me there would have been traditions that he started, such as the placement of flags or something, that kept on in the decades following. So I would think that his his legacy is much greater, in that area. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ron. To your last point, the autobiographical material in the collection is not huge. He really, even probably compared to other people, what you'd end up collecting over the course of a lifetime about yourself. There was some, and one of the things were letters of acknowledgement and thanks from people like the principal for the work that he did, and the times, particularly times when there were really difficult logistics that he surmounted in order to ensure something happened and it happened well. So there is that element of it. It's interesting. No, I've not spoken to anyone. And it's only been family members, and one family member who spoke to even get a sense of what he was like as a person. So it's definitely an area for more research, and it would be interesting to see that. I'm looking at people here to say, did anyone work with him? Does anyone in the room remember? Oh, okay. So
He's been very helpful with events with the Alumni Association.
Tom Thompson was head of the Alumni Association, just so.
All of those things.
Yeah.
And when I saw the name, I never associated with anything that you were talking about today. He just did an excellent job
There we go.
and very helpful throughout the university. That's how I remember.
Thank you. So Tom said he was very helpful in the university, and that's why I knew of him, and didn't know about this whole other life. I believe you have a question, please.
Yeah. Hi, my name's Brian. Thank
Brian.
you, Chris. That was wonderful. That was a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I've worked in academia for maybe the last decade, and about half of that time in the humanities. And I'm embarrassed to say I have never visited a rare collections or had that level of engagement with the library. Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking about how incredibly rich this collection is, right? And yeah, just what a wonderful, wonderful resource it is. And it's making me start to wonder what other wonderful, wonderful resources you have. And I'm thinking about, and this is an unfair question, but how we bridge the gap between these incredible resources and potential partnerships with scholars that don't recognize the kind of wealth that you have, but also with the rest of the community. Again, it feels like this collection is in part, either is or ought to be part of the heritage of a broader community, and how you facilitate the kind of dissemination of that wealth.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you've encapsulated one of our biggest challenges, and I think and when it does work, one of our biggest joys, and that is that idea of publicizing collections and outreach, and not just to a sort of closed circle of scholars, but well beyond that, because we think of our collections as being material for everyone and anyone. So we don't just think of our constituency as being McGill people or researchers, but anyone who has an interest in this material. So cataloging is one. It sounds like a mundane thing, but even just being able to find stuff in the catalog and say, oh, there's this, is part of it. Part of it's word of mouth. Part of it is trying to speak to, at least in the history department, students who, usually it's graduate students, and finding out what they're interested in, and from there being able to suggest things. And I suspect Adria has been, my colleague Adria, who curates our archival collections, has been involved in a few of those in fact this past week, where we had groups, and we'll tell them about what we have. A lot of it's outreach. We have a very vigorous outreach program, and we do a number of events, and they're usually tied to a collection in one way or another. So that'll be an opportunity to speak of things, and we hope in next February we did, and we've had exhibitions where we have guest curators, and we've done things like the 50th anniversary of the Congress of Black Writers. We had an exhibition that we curated, Professor Austin, and that was another example of that. So it really is. We always feel like it always feels like too little, and it always feels like not enough, but we do what we can, and I think just the fact that you all now know about something like this, should the opportunity come up for yourself or someone you know, we do that. A lot of word of mouth. That's a huge part of it as well. Instagram, we got 10,000 Instagram followers. So we put stuff up on Instagram. They say like, oh yeah, we'll do that. So that's it. Ingrid, you understand what this is like. You know, all our institutions, we try doing that. I mean, there's a lot out there. There's a lot of stimulus out there. So it's hard to get people's attention. If you've got any advice, please let me know. Thank you. Do we have...
Jeanette has a question. Jeanette, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Jeanette.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. The level of discrimination is so appalling. I hope it's behind us. I mean, we always think that these things happen elsewhere, like south of the border, but this just, it's really horrible. I have a question for you. I'm not sure if I followed exactly. You mentioned the $1 bill, and you mentioned Viola Desmond, and you mentioned the theater, and I was wondering, what is on this dollar bill? Did you mention that, or did I lose this?
No, it did. I showed a picture of it. It's a $10 bill.
Oh, okay.
And I showed the picture, and it's her portrait on it. I don't know if there's anything else on the bill itself which is significant too. Is there? Is it the bottom of it shows a seating arrangement? Yes. Okay. Ah, okay. So it actually shows the interior and where people were sitting inside the Roseland Theatre.
Thank you. Thank you. I was
Now you got me wondering.
having dinner while I was listening to you, so I didn't see the photo.
No, all I got's Wilfrid Laurier. Sorry. And they didn't throw him out of the Roseland Theatre. So, sorry. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Viola and Roy
I think it's a parallel story, but it makes one wonder. She didn't live in New Glasgow, so that's where I think they may have crossed paths somewhere along the lines, because she was the one who really pursued it as an issue with Carrie Best, who was a publisher in New Glasgow at the time. So they might have had mutual acquaintance. Hard to imagine, but again, great question. I don't know if any of the family has archives or things like that, and if they do, if they're ever looking for a home for them to just fill in the story. Oh, we have a hand up with Adria.
Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, Brenda.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Hi, thank you. I'm Brenda Paris. I'm one of his other nieces in
Oh
Toronto.
my goodness, welcome. I'm sorry I didn't mention you by name. I didn't.
Two of us here from Toronto, in addition to our Nova Scotian cousins.
Fantastic.
Just a couple of questions. Thank you for doing this presentation. And I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is we never really explore Blackness in Canada in any thorough way, let alone history and significance of people. And my uncle's significance was quite broad, not only as a national leader, with the National Black Coalition, which he helped establish, but even in Quebec. And I have met many, many people who worked with him in the various community organizations who spoke very highly of him. So it's important to understand this history because they're just not faceless names, so to speak. But secondly, it's also important to put the Canadian context in place here. Everyone always speaking about things in the States, and surely we're not like that. And then with our rescuer mentality with the Underground Railroad story, which of course always ignores the blacks that were here way before the Underground Railroad, which in the case of our family, has this attempt to diminish and dismiss and wipe out the true history of Canada. Mm-hmm. And because we're not immigrants in the traditional sense, we can't be dismissed because we're not from other places, and why don't you go back home? Mm-hmm. This is our home. So I think it's important that this material be used and widely available. And that was one of our concerns as a family when he passed away. When it was left at McGill, we were concerned it wouldn't be held together as a collection, concerned that it wouldn't be distributed properly. And so there were grave concerns when that happened. And So I'd like to ask the question about exactly what sort of outreach your organization and department is making to the Black community, that this is an available resource. And what is the nature of the outreach that you're doing, that that people can truly understand that this is a very unique collection with a very Canadian focus, even though many of the articles obviously are from different contexts. But, the perception and understanding of Canada and its role of anti-Black racism is really not understood thoroughly. So I think it's important. My uncle was not captured by the ultra-left, so whether he bought his books at Ho Chi Minh bookstore, I don't want to diminish him as if he was considered a left-winger that you can just ignore. Indeed, he was considered for the senatorship in Canada, which instead went to Ann Cools, which is, we can speak about it another time. Right. And with his military background, incredible community background. So, and he was seen as a resource by many of the international students, African and Caribbean in particular, and certainly was a conduit for information in the Sir George Williams incident. Mm-hmm. So he was really quite central in many ways in the Black Montreal community. And so I'm wondering to what extent, what sort of outreach you've been able to do or will be doing in the near future to try and get this resource properly used, because it's now 40 years since he died. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of enough time to do outreach, but not knowing your workload and et cetera, can you speak to that issue of how you're trying to ensure it does get used?
Well, thank you very much for your question, Ms. Brenda, and it's an honor to meet you. So thank you for being here. I think the extent of the outreach that this collection has is comparable to the outreach that probably other collections have had, insofar as some of it's been cataloged. It's described on our website. We do give talks. We have used it in exhibitions, that material. It's more than probably many other collections, but still not enough. If that's paradox, doesn't sound silly, but that's
meaning it's not fully cataloged yet.
A lot of it's cataloged and listed, and we do have a finding aid for it as well. We could probably get individual items cataloged. So if one looks it up in the catalog, one can find it in descriptions, and we do have lists of everything as well, and it is described on the website. So there's a number of things that make it visible, and more visible than a number of other collections. There's also efforts like I'm describing now to make people aware of it and to use it as well. But you can always do more. And I think it's always nice if people in the community come forth and engage with it and then in turn tell about it, because I'll be very frank. I can promote it as a librarian and curator. I don't necessarily feel I can do so and would not want to take the voice of the community and
Sure.
discussing it as well.
But you don't know what you don't know. So to ask the community to be involved in requesting things is a little priceless, frankly. Because if they don't know about it, then how can they know to use it or request it? So right. I would just suggest that some thought and effort be given to how best this can be used, expanded, deployed. Is it finding some funds to maybe do a graduate grant for people to do original research? There's any number of ways we can encourage, and there are funds and grants available for those sorts of things. So it's just a suggestion, but I think in terms of being respectful of the nature of this collection, I would hope that those things would be accomplished.
I absolutely. And the other thing is, thank you. And the other thing would be, if there's ever an opportunity to speak to you a bit more about your memories, and that I think that would help to put some flesh on the sort of the skeleton I presented.
Sure.
That would be wonderful. If you want, if there's any way, if you want to reach out, my email's, I'm on the website, it's christopher.lyons@mcgill.ca, and we can start with that perhaps. Thank you. Great.
Thank you very much.
Great. I'm seeing glasses of wine go back and forth, and it's you're taunting me. That's what you're doing. You're just taunting me. That's as I'll drink my water. Are there other questions? Is there any other? questions? No? Okay, I don't want to put you on the spot. Just you had a... If you're, oh, good. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, it was just in continuation of that. My name is Emily, by the way.
Hi, Emily.
I'm in my 4.5 year here at McGill. Earlier you mentioned that we have 10,000 followers on McGill's Instagram, and just to kind of add to the pool of ideas in terms of bettering community outreach, I think social media is such a weapon nowadays that can be used for good, and having followers on that platform I don't think is enough, and perhaps making better, taking better initiatives in the future to bridge all these wonderful things that are happening here that a lot of lay people outside of even the McGill community don't really know is happening.
Yeah.
I myself, I even actually, for the last few years, have been working at McGill's Student Phone-a-thon office.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, so...
Super, thank you for that.
It's cool getting to work for McGill, I guess, and also learn at McGill, but there we're constantly calling even McGill graduates and friends and part of the McGill community, and constantly informing them of the different initiatives that are happening now, the different funds that require more funding. And just even from that kind of perspective, that could be an opportunity to let a lot of the people who are constantly donating to various initiatives, hello? Various initiatives within McGill, both student-led and not student-led, is it still working?
No.
Oh, is it? Okay, sorry. Just that to let those people, especially many of whom have access to funding, that
we can do a duet.
Oh, okay.
Here.
I like karaoke. Thank you. Yes, thank you. I'm in communication all the time with people within the McGill community, a lot of whom have access to financial resources that a lot of people don't, that really could help fund these projects and help make things happen, such as a grant opportunity, like you had mentioned just now on Zoom. I think there's a lot of really creative ways that we could work on making this a bit more accessible to the public, in ways that are not that costly as well. So whether it be through these newsletters to groups of people that really could benefit from learning this as well themselves, I think. Yeah, just to kind of keep the ball rolling. I lost my train of thought a little.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's great. Thank you very much, Emily. That's a wonderful idea. Yep. Okay.
So thank you, Chris. That was wonderful and really insightful. I learned some things about Roy States that I didn't know, and there are probably folks in the wider Black community who still remember him and would have some stories that would be interesting to collect. And it's making me just think that there's a book to be written about him of some kind or another. So that was my comment. And then one of those pictures that flashed by was a picture of Henry Langdon, who was Malcolm X's cousin. He was a pilot in the Air Force and then for Air Canada. And yeah, a very long time ago, I did an interview with him in the 1990s when he was still alive, and he would talk about going to visit his Malcolm X's family in Michigan, and he would get to fly there for free because he worked for Air Canada. Yeah, so just an example of like the things that you uncover along the way that are in that archive. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think I heard where was it? It's something along that lines, but I didn't know it was him, and I didn't know we had the picture of him. That's wonderful, and I didn't know you spoke to him too.
You have a question on the screen, Chris.
But I think it's, I'm looking at your students going, yeah, student project. That might be very good. So we have a Zoom question. Hi. Oh, you'll need to unmute yourself, please.
Hi.
Hi.
You can hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, I'm Margaret States, and I'm a niece.
How do you do, Margaret?
And I appreciate you doing this presentation. And as Brenda mentioned, there's much more to our Uncle Roy than what you said. I think it's more the character that's missing. And I knew him as a kid. I met him several times as a teenager. And to me, he was physically bigger than life. He was very tall, man, very, his presence, when he entered a room, you knew he entered a room.
Mm-hmm.
And what is really sad about his life is that because of the racism in New Glasgow, I grew up in New Glasgow.
Okay.
Because of that, he could have been so much more.
Right.
I'm not sure at what grade level he was at when he left school,
Right.
but there was no opportunity. There was no one encouraging someone like him, and he was a good student apparently. No one encouraging him to stay in school. You can be. There was never anything like that. As a matter of fact, I was in high school in the 60s, and teachers didn't encourage me to be. It was as if the best I could be was a secretary. And, I didn't have to go to university for that, but I did go to university, and I ended up being a teacher. I'm a retired teacher, but all of that to say that the essence of racism, which was mentioned by someone earlier, and I felt that for her, it was, she was trying to understand it. And to have lived in that kind of environment, there was a time when I know my uncle was bitter. He was bitter about what went on in New Glasgow when he was growing up. He was bitter about what continued to go on in New Glasgow. But at some point in his life, he mellowed. He seemed to have recognized that not everyone who had white skin was racist. And those were feelings he held for a long time because of the treatment towards him. But his collection, which I did see when it was in his apartment, and I did use it when I was working on my master's degree, when it was at McGill during the early days. And then for a while, it kind of was there, but it wasn't there. And I remember having that discussion with Brenda about where is this collection? And she checked into it and was told it's still there. And for me to have seen this, there was going to be this presentation today, I was like, wow. They've realized that there is merit in what he collected during his lifetime, right? And, you can contact me or I can contact you. We can have further discussion. I'm going to do something which might not be kosher, but I'm going to put a plug in here for my book. I just recently published a book called Gooseberries Have Thorns. It's a historical biography. And the reason why I decided I would do a little advertisement for my book is I know there are many in the audience wondering, why was Nova Scotia so racist? We know racism still exists, but what was going on in Glasgow was parallel to what was going on in southern United States. And if you read my book, you will get an understanding of the basis of some of that racism, the origin of it. That's what I expose in this book. It's, just to give you a little bit of the background, it is about a person who is a descendant, a direct descendant of loyalists of African descent who came to Nova Scotia after the War of Independence, the American War of Independence. And you can see by her life what was, I say her life epitomizes the life of an African-Canadian female, not only during her lifetime, which was from the 1890s to the 1940s, when finally at the age 50, she became a homeowner with her husband, and in a neighborhood that was the only neighborhood in New Glasgow where they could buy a home or buy land in the town of New Glasgow. So you get a background of what was going on in New Glasgow and what was also going on in Nova Scotia during a historical time. This is a piece of Canadian history that we certainly haven't read in any textbook, in any school. You can find this book. You can just by the title, Gooseberries Have Thorns. You can just Google it, and you can see where you can purchase it. It's Friesen Press. If you want to go directly to the publisher, it's Friesen Press.
Okay.
Okay. But I will also send you, Chris, that information, so perhaps you could make that available.
Yep, I've already written it down. Yep.
Okay, okay.
Good. And thank you so much, Miss Margaret, for speaking up. And yes, I do very much look forward to speaking to you as well. And I think that that's wonderful. I'm so grateful that you're coming forward, and we can capture your memories and the contextual information you have, which I think is so important for understanding this. So this is far better than I was anticipating. Thank you. Well, this is definitely the highlight. It wasn't my droning on for half an hour, I'll tell you that. Are there any other questions? No. Yes. Oh, yes. I think we're swapping.
Oh, you're right. It's not working. I forgot. Yeah. So I was just wondering, with the renovations that are going on with the library, is it going to be hard to access these materials during that time, or are these kinds of archives going to be available?
Thank you very much. So what Professor Givens is referring to is the fact that in approximately 14 to 16 months or so, there will be a major renovation project and construction project which will start at the library. And what we need to do is empty the whole building out. That's the whole McLennan Redpath complex. So that's the circulating collection, rare collections, and that. We're working on logistics to minimize as much as possible the period of time where things won't be accessible, but things will be accessible. It won't be for the whole, however long it takes to build the building. It'll be for a fraction of that so that we can get that, because we certainly don't want people not to be able to do research for 3 years or so while this is going on. And one little hint to everyone, if there's stuff you're going to be working on, you say, like, you know what, if we know ahead of time, we can make we're hoping to make, in those cases, even additional allowances to say, like, okay, we won't move it out to where we have to move stuff, we'll keep it aside, make it easier, but in no way do we want anyone to be, like, completely without. So thank you for that. I think at that point, I would just invite you to take the microphone yet again for the closing benediction. Anyway, I'd like everyone to bow your heads.
I'm not a minister of any kind, but thanks so much for this. I'll be very brief because I think it was a great presentation, a great set of questions. I'm excited to hear about this collection and that we are able to be here in person, because I started at McGill a year ago, and I feel like I'm just starting, because I'm really just starting to meet people and get out and learn more things about these collections. But what's interesting to me is my father's name was Roy, and he was in the military. He did not go to college because, black people like him didn't go to college in the 1940s when he was in high school. And he joined the military because otherwise he was probably going to get drafted. And so this way he could join the Air Force. And I think there's so many interesting stories out there, because my father was in the U.S. in Pittsburgh. And and I've been learning a lot about my mother's side of the family as well, and that we had actually ancestors who came from Quebec to Opelousas, Louisiana. And so that's really inspired my interest in learning more about my Quebec roots and so on. And so, I'm inspired by this to really start, passing along this knowledge to those of us who are working on the strategy to address anti-Black racism here at McGill. I want to set up a time for us to come and for you to talk to us about the archives, because I know there's a lot of interest in learning more about what's, the history in Montreal. And David, people have told me your name, that we need to connect because of that, to learn more about what you've been doing on Montreal and its history. So in any case, it's, I think we have a tendency to forget that how important the history is. And, I want to mention, somebody was asking about racism. I mean, 3 years ago, we had 8 Black faculty out of 1,700 at McGill, and now we're up to 35. So there's been a shift that's starting to happen, but we're still early days of getting that going. And so I think there is a strong desire to work on these issues, but there's a lot of work to do. And, what we see in these materials is just a reminder that, this isn't ancient history. This is very real, and that we need to be vigilant going forward. And that's why my book that Chris very kindly mentioned, it's okay, but just to say that I was very interested in, I did a deep dive into the history so I could understand for myself how all these things were connected, as well as to hopefully enlighten my political science colleagues to understand how important this history is, to understand how we've gotten to where we are today, and that you cannot understand politics in basically transatlantic, because I have very much a transatlantic focus, without understanding that history. So I would just say this is a great example of somebody who has pulled together materials that we might not otherwise know even existed, and that it's important that we all stay connected to that. So thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and I will end it there. Thank you. All right.
Thank you very much, Terry. And thank you, Chris. The next meeting is the 200th meeting of the James McGill Society. I'm pleased to say it's going to be a crackerjack meeting. It's on Monday, November the 7th, and the presenter is Tim Cook of the Canadian Museum of History, in particular the Canadian War Museum. And he will be talking about his take on Canadian military medicine with the McGill context, the third, I think it was, General Hospital. And his latest book has come out, so you might see that flogged. We, to our guests, we have nothing against you flogging your own book at the JMS, so you're welcome to do so. And in fact, we're delighted that we have people doing that. So Tim Cook is coming on the 7th, and it's also the Stanley Frost Annual Lecture. I just want to say that your continuing support for the James McGill Society is very much appreciated. It will be our so-called 200th birthday next time, and it's the end of the 200th anniversary of celebrations of our university. Today started off as a rather solemn day, of course, with the funeral of Her late Majesty, and it would be wrong not to mention the connections for a second or two between this university and the Crown. In fact, two of the great-granddaughters of the Queen are the children of a McGill graduate, and actually a woman from Montreal, from Pointe Claire. The university was set up as the Royal Institution for the Advancement of Learning, and the Royal Institution still exists in the form of McGill's Board of Governors. And the visitor to the university is the Governor General. So we've had Governor Generals who've come from the royal family in the past who took an interest in this university. And of course, we have Canadian-born Governors General who take an interest in it now. I'll just end it with God Save the King. Thank you.